From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Walter Edgar, welcoming you to our podcast series about South Carolina culture and history, with a nod to all things Southern. Today, Alfred Turner and I will talk to Dr. Eric Crawford, a Gullah Geechee scholar and Associate Professor of Musicology at Claflin University in Orangeburg. He's going to share stories of Gullah culture and will tell us about editing the second edition of the late Wilbur Cross's book, Gullah Culture in America.
Gullah Culture in America chronicles the history and culture of the Gullah people who live in the Lowcountry region of the American South. The book tells the story of the arrival of enslaved West Africans to the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia, and the melding of their African cultures, which created distinct Creole language, cuisine, traditions, and arts.
Eric, welcome to Walter Edgar's Journal. I think some of our folks hear terms today and they get confused. People talk about the Gullah Geechee corridor, what is Gullah or what is Geechee? So let's define those terms to begin with.
Yes, and there's always that sort of debate as to what it is. Gullah, I believe, traces back to Angola. There was during the Denmark Vesey Rebellion, there was a person named Gullah Jack. He was from Angola. And so we believe over time, instead of saying Angola, Gullah became that shortened version. Mm-hmm. There's also, however, a Gullah tribe in Western Africa, and believe also that can be traced there as well. Geechee, we believe, can be traced to two meanings. And there was the Ogeechee River in Georgia, where some of the enslaved Africans settled, and so they were called Geechees. There's also a Geechee tribe in West Africa, near Liberia, and that could also be a possible origin. But in common terms, typically those who are in Georgia cling to being Geechees. Those in South Carolina tend to call themselves more Gullahs. And so now we try and have this combination, Gullah Geechee. There's also this corridor that was created through the help of Congressman Clyburn. It was a Gullah Geechee corridor, which embraces actually North Carolina down through Florida. Those 4 states and 20 miles inland. And so that comprises this Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor.
And part of that shows the expansion of rice culture from South Carolina because they expanded into North Carolina, of course into Georgia. And even people forget that when Florida became English in the colonial period, South Carolinians moved to Florida.
Indeed, yes. And so, here in South Carolina, we use the term Carolina gold, and that's how priceless rice was.
All right. Well, for many years, people thought Gullah was a Creole language, Pidgin English. This is what the fancy wordsmiths described it at the turn of the 20th century. But that's not the case at all. It is a language.
It is. And, one of my challenges in life is to really promote the aspect that it's not corrupt English. Though it has English loan words here, it's based upon a West African foundation, and that goes back to Winslow Dow Turner, who first found that in the 40s and 50s. And so we have this culture that is based upon West African words, lexicon, syntax. And so even though the enslaved were brought here to this country, they still remembered how their language went. And there was a sense of a Creole that was very common in Sierra Leone and Liberia and West Africa. And because oftentimes the white planters brought the enslaved from similar parts of West Africa, they all knew this Creole. Many of them were from Sierra Leone and Georgia. And so, we've had these trips back to Sierra Leone. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes the young Gullahs from St. Helena and from Georgia can speak clearly to those in Sierra Leone in that Creole. And that ties together, those two countries and those two worlds.
One of the interesting reasons that Gullah culture survived was the way, certainly in South Carolina, the enslavers created their plantations. Rice plantations weren't these 10,000-acre things. They created small working plantations with 40 or 50 enslaved persons there, maybe a white overseer, maybe not. So for 200 years, that community lived in isolation from the white world.
Right. And in fact, during the summer months, during the malarial months, those white planters' families would kind of leave, leaving maybe an overseer there. And so the enslaved were further isolated. Not to mention they were on an island, so there was no bridge there. And so this culture stayed there. And even today, they have these communes almost. They're still isolated oftentimes. And so this language, this culture still survives today. I had a young lady at Claflin. I was at the educational office just sitting there, and this girl comes in speaking pure Gullah. I sat there amazed. I said, well, where are you from? North Charleston. And I said to myself, my gosh, she's maybe 20 years old, and her great-grandmother still is alive. I can only imagine how she speaks.
Wow. I'd like to move now into the role of Penn Center in terms of Gullah culture. It has positives and negatives. Positives in the fact that these white women primarily came from the North during the Civil War and created a school for the freed persons, but wanted them to forget their primitive ways, language, what have you.
It's very complex. I oftentimes get on a given day, I'll think one way and then change. As I did this book, it amazed me to kind of track through Laura Towns, from sort of her view. I'll go into this area there and the Union troops who were very difficult to her and uncritical, and then having to be in this place that she had to actually do drills with her soldiers there in order to, because there was a fear of the Confederate Army coming there. Mm-hmm. So she had to do these drills with firearms. And the idea that her first class, there were babies there or adults. And so it was very difficult conditions. And so, being a teacher, I can only sympathize with her in what she had to do. And so for her, she used these northern educational methods, and it proved fantastic. They were able to quickly learn to read and speak. And to her, I think for her, it was best that they not speak any Gullah. Now, as we kind of look back upon that, we can call it being paternal, being unfair, but she was able to get these students who could not read, who could not write, to be able to function in a world that she saw was uncritical for them. It can be said that there could have been some way to balance. Mm-hmm. We can allow them to do the ring shout. We can allow them to speak at home their language. But, with any students, the best way to get them to learn, to educate them, is that there's consistency not only in school but also at home too. So as a teacher, I can understand that. Now, as a musicologist, as a historian, it's a shame that the culture had to lose so much as a result.
Eric, was she from New England?
Oh, up north. I'm not sure. I think Massachusetts perhaps, but they were somewhere, Boston, somewhere up there.
I'm just wondering how much of that stern New England way of teaching had to add to some of that too.
Well, Philadelphians played a major role.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Quakers. It's all very. This isn't loose Episcopalians. This is very rigid pedagogy.
Yeah. But when you're in, these conditions, if you think about malaria is killing your friends, and you're with these people, and it's uncertainty, and they don't trust you, you can't understand them. And these troops aren't helping at all. So those are very difficult conditions. So I tend to be forgiving.
And she ended up learning to speak Gullah, did she?
She was fluent in Gullah and was a wonderful nurse, too. And so, in fact, she would begin to use some of the remedies for things, life everlasting, sassafras, those things. And so I think in the end, she began to appreciate it.
Well, there's so many facets of Gullah culture that for years most white folks ignored. In fact, they usually ignored Gullah because that was slave talk, although even in the 18th and 19th century, there were white Carolinians who did learn Gullah, but it was rare.
There's a point in my book, and it asks, can a white person learn to speak Gullah? And I said, yes, they can. But I said, But a white child never is fully in that black child's world. And so in the end, they can speak, but they never are privy to that black child's world.
Well, here's a story that's personal. My late mother-in-law, when she was, and if she were alive today, she'd be in her late 80s. She was from Clarendon County. But she and her mother moved to Columbia, South Carolina, and she was at one of the older high schools. Actually, I think it was a middle school at that time, or junior high. And suddenly, this young woman from the Lowcountry comes up, and no one can understand her. But Mary Alice Rogers could, because she could speak Gullah. And so she was this child's translator and eased her into this culture shock that she was experiencing, which I'm sure must have been great.
I think for educators, especially those who are in the Low Country, it would help them greatly if they at least had a working knowledge of Gullah language.
Sure.
As they hear these kids, encounter these kids, they can now best help them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, even though people are now putting Gullah in books, Gullah was a spoken language,
Yes.
and that goes with verb contents. If you said, I come for we house,
Perfect Gullah.
but in the context, it could mean I'm going to the house, I am at the house, and part of the expression would be, Eric would be looking at me, and how I say that, he's reading my body language.
But for any language, there is an informal approach and more formalized. And so I think for Gullah, having, I think it's good to have something now, something formal. And it took them 30 years to come to that. But now we have the Gullah Bible, and Joe Opala now is working on a grammar book as well as a literary book that would be in Gullah. And so I think for me, having a beginning point, a point to tell those who are Gullah, this is your language. I remember Joe Opala came to Coastal Carolina University and taught a course on Gullah language. Seeing those Gullah speakers come out and say, I never knew what I spoke was a language, and a sense of pride. And so for us, we need more of those. Yes, there would be so many variations. There would be those who say, now this is the way I talk it here. But in terms of having these guides, these books, these versions that we can say, this is how the language is spoken generally. And seeing it in print gives that culture validity, I believe. But, one of the things I think is important is spirituals have codes. You could change the word here and there. But oftentimes it's also the speed, the tone, the voice arising that could change a meaning drastically. And that was sort of the genius of the enslaved.
Before we went on the air, you were saying, as a musicologist, the spiritual kumbaya. That term people use is not what the Gullah started out saying.
No. In fact, it translates to actually come by here. There was a 1925 recording in Charleston, and the first words were come by here. And because the enslaved couldn't say the H sound, it would be come by ya. And for those who come to the islands, to the corridor here, those who are from the islands call themselves Benyas. They've been here. They're from here. Those who are visiting are called Kamyas. They're coming here. And so I believe that kumbaya, as we tend to say it, means come here, Lord, come here. And so I'm at Claflin now, and I have a wonderful co-director, Dr. Charlie Toomer, and he really pushed me to do an arrangement. And so the very first one that I arranged was kumbaya as kamya. And it begins with this sense of come here, Lord. It begins with saying kamya, kamya, kamya. And then they go into the song. I believe that the undergo spirituals that I call them now Gullah songs, where, we oftentimes have kept the melodies, we've kept some of the tunes, but the language has been lost over time. How they actually would have sounded, this is now my musicological thoughts now. But so for me, it's about reconnecting that to its Gullah Geechee origins.
Well, one of the things some people are familiar with is the myths of the Lowcountry, the landscape, particularly the things that came out of the Charleston Renaissance in the 20s and 30s, haints and flat eyes. You're smiling, but a lot of white folks who grew up in the Lowcountry, they share those beliefs.
Every Gullah person I've ever spoken to, or Gullah Geechee person, they have said that they have seen a flat eye or a haint or a boohag. Mm. And it seems, they are just adamant in that sense of seeing them. And it does kind of, of course, I think some would say that the spiritual world is as real as the physical world. And so I think oftentimes in that culture, they go hand in hand, because they would have this conjurer oftentimes who would kind of hold both worlds in their hands, the sense of being Christian, yet still being, that sense of spiritual. And that was important for the enslaved.
Yeah, again, a personal story. My grandmother on my mother's side was born in 1890, and she lived most of her life down around Branchville and Denmark and all down that way. The stories told straight, dead-eyed, serious about the things they saw, things that you would consider supernatural, perhaps impossible if you're of a scientific bent, but were as real to her as the Sunday meeting at the church.
Right.
Just as real. Yeah.
And again, back to the West African connections, that sense of spirits being in inanimate objects as well, that sense of that tree, that animal there, that flat eye that's now shaping, and that sense of boohag who can shed their skin and then ride and then torment other people, that was as real to them. And some could say that translates in their language, in their religion, and in their songs. Yes, it's amazing when you see the African American religion, spirituality in all of its forms, being very, very still, being very, very fervent, being very, very physical, and then that sense of getting to that frenzy. It encompasses so very much. They were Christians, yet they very much were tied to the ancestral, to a spiritual world too. And as you saw, the ring shout, that sense of connection to, that being born and that death, and a sense of being reborn again altogether.
For folks from off, talk about a ring shout.
It's this counterclockwise dance, and so the feet could not come off the ground, and the legs could not cross. But it was their sense of having a fun time. It was their dance.
And there's someone calling, right?
Well, there were bassers who would stand out, who were the kind of the band. They would clap and they would stomp, and then you would have song lyrics inside who would keep it going. Again, and these songs were all religious, yet again they were really kind of bordering on having, to me, the first nightclub in a sense, because they would show themselves, hips would be gyrating. Yet still these songs were all based upon the Bible. Like one was called Adam in a Garden Picking Up Leaf. And they would do it, and they would speed up slowly and slowly and slowly. And then, of course, this frenzy would come upon them, this spirit.
And you referred to the praise house, which is the term now used for houses of worship. Mm-hmm. But it started off as actually a P-R-A-Y house, where prayers were said. It's now praise is the common way it's displayed, but it started out as P-R-A-Y.
And the old elders still say prayer house. They don't say praise house. They'll say this is a prayer house. And again, it was a place that they would begin in very formal ceremony. They would have a prayer, they would have scripture. Then they would move the benches aside. And now it's time to move and have a good time in the Lord, though.
Okay.
That's important.
Indeed,
yes, indeed. I have to ask a question now about the book. because this is the second edition. The first was in the, 2008 or thereabouts?
Yes.
How did you get involved? And tell me about Wilbur Cross, who was the author of the original book.
Editor, he was someone who retired at Hilton Head, and he had written, I think, like over 40 books. And so he came upon this. I believe he was intrigued by this culture. And so he did several interviews, and he did some research, and Blair Publishing published this book here. And it was a wonderful kind of look at as many aspects of a culture as possible. And so you have music, art, language, celebrations, all the above. And so I was called maybe a year or so ago by Blair Publishing saying, Dr. Crawford, we were given your name, and would you consider doing a new edition? I said, well, it sounds great. But then they said, well, could you do it in 3 months? I said, well, is that possible? And because he said, well, yeah, this is a very popular book here, and we need to have it, on the bookshelves here. And so I took upon myself to do a complete rewrite in 3 months.
Wow.
But I called upon friends to help. And the thing that I will say, it stretched me so very much in areas I never thought about, food. And so I remember doing food, and I said, well, maybe I'll do some recipes. So I would call people, Emery Campbell, and say, well, now, how do you do that recipe? He would say, well, Eric, this is what I do. And Veronica Gerald as well. And they were very kind to share their recipes and their thoughts on various areas.
Well, beginning in the 1960s and 70s, scholars began to discover the Gullah world and write. And, of course, the late Charles Joyner in Down by the Riverside put it on a big stage. But there were also African Americans who began to do their own. Anita Singleton Prather as Aunt Pearlie Sue, Ron and Natalie Days. This brought Gullah to a much larger stage.
I always tell people, Marlena Small as well, there are such great artists that oftentimes are not known globally and should be. Anita Singleton Prather, as you mentioned, Marlena Smalls, Ron and Natalie Days. These are wonderful talents that should be known by everyone. Well, I'll tell you what's new for me. I'm going to Texas, tracing these Black Seminoles who fled from South Carolina down to Florida, and now we're in Texas and Mexico. And there was someone did a recording of a lady, old woman in Mexico, who sang "This May Be the Last Time," this Gullah song. She only spoke Spanish, but she remembered this song from her ancestors, this song that had been taught to her, and it's purely Gullah. And so I have that recording, which to me connects so well to the Johns Allen version of that song, and that sense of though they've left and it's been generation after generation, they still remember how important some of these things are, the food and the songs are.
This may be my last time. This may be my last time. This may be my last time. It may be my last time. I don't know. I got more than born before. Maybe my last time. I don't know. Oh, this may be my last time. This may be my last time. This may be.
Wow. English is not her language, but
No.
she remembered the Gullah.
Yes, and and these words may have no meaning to her in terms of what they mean, but she knew it was important to sing this song to continue this tradition.
That's amazing.
It's sad that in many ways, Gullah culture, as much as we're trying to protect it, it's also under constant threat through young people not carrying on traditions, whether it is the language or the folk art or what have you. People are moving away. And you think of what has happened to the development of our coast, and Gullah communities have been broken up.
It's challenging. I think that's why at a university, a college, we have an opportunity to be able to educate, and we have this a wonderful young force of people, of educators, and so our students, for me, are our best allies here. I brought in my older singers, and they were singing the old songs, and the Claflin choir has learned to speak and sing Gullah. So to have the older singers there with them, and as they were being filmed, there wasn't a dry eye there. Those who were younger knew how important it was that they continue this culture. Because my singers from St. Helena Island are once 87, once 85, and soon they will not be singing. So they were grabbing onto this. As you mentioned, many communities, they've lost their land. And the raising and the higher taxes for these communities, many times they can't afford it. And so then they lose their home again. And so for us, it's about finding a way to be able to, in fact, on St. Helena Island, there was a developer who wanted to build a golf course. And the community rose together to stop that. But that will continue. And it becomes, how can we protect them, preserve them? And not just that, but understand how valuable they are to our culture going forward.
All right. It's time for us to wind up. So any last words for our listeners?
Well, I want to say for everyone, I'm sure, being here with you has always been my greatest joy and my biggest wish. So to be here a second time is just wonderful. So thank you for having me here, and thank you for being such a strong advocate for the Gullah Geechee culture.
It's a very important part of all of our history here in South Carolina. I hope you enjoyed today's journal. I know that I did. Gullah culture is foundational to the traditions and foodways of Lowcountry, South Carolina. However, in the 21st century, it is a culture that faces steep challenges in trying to maintain the language, beliefs, and cultural touchstones that helped it thrive in the past. The efforts to preserve and promote Gullah culture in our state are important in maintaining traditions that are important to all South Carolinians.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
Many of the books discussed on Walter Edgar's Journal can be found as part of the Walter Edgar's Journal Book Nook section at all good books in Columbia, South Carolina, or may be available from your local bookstore. We'll talk again soon.